Raj Patel, a writer, academic, activist, fellow at Food First, a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley's Center for African Studies, the author of 2 best-selling books, Stuffed and Starved and The Value of Nothing. He straddles both a popular orientation in writing, but also an academic one.
Thanks, Tony. We were threatened as someone... Microphone. Can you hear that? Can you hear me now? Excellent. Thanks, Peter. So we were threatened with being tasered, and as someone who works at the University of California, where Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Janet Napolitano is soon to be our Chancellor. This is a real and present danger. So I'm actually going to try and go short. But I want to talk about food sovereignty as a signifier on the move. Mark Edelman's paper is really interesting to show us where food sovereignty has come from. But it's hard to keep up with it because it is dialectically being invented and reinvented at every Via Campesina meeting. And of course, what Bina was showing us earlier on today is part of a trajectory. And I think what's really exciting about food sovereignty is precisely the sort of dialectical relationship between movement reality and people outside the movement. That said, it started somewhere, and it started in a particular moment in a particular food regime. Food sovereignty was born of peasants up against a neoliberal state in Europe and Central America. And so it's hard to see food sovereignty, and this is a sort of just a point of observation. Food sovereignty is hard to find or to see satisfyingly in Warsaw Pact countries, for example, that were not in a similar sort of moment. And so while Cuba, for example, is a sort of go-to place for food sovereignty at a nation-state level, it's harder to see that in China and in Russia. And although Max Spurer's paper is a really interesting attempt to see that, and Mindy Schneider's work guides us in the right direction, I think we have a lot more work to do to understand what food sovereignty looks like in states that are far more authoritarian. The second thing is around class. I think Henry is right about class. Again, this is important to recognize that food sovereignty emerges as a thing that landless rural workers and the Karnataka State Farmers Association, middle peasants, can both agree on. And in order for that agreement to be able to move forward, and in order for this this dialectical process to emerge, yet some things had to be sort of left out so we could go through that birth canal. And so there's these class contradictions, I think, are important, and they are under-theorized, I think, and so that's why I thought Theodore's remarks this morning were really provocative, but I'm not sure that they're right. I'm not sure that it's true that Via Campesina is a peasant movement becoming a class for itself, because it's hard for landless peasants and landed peasants who have 100,000 acres, or not 100,000 acres, but say 100 to 500 acres to be in a satisfying way, Marxist way, in the same class. So that's, I think there are ways to address that question. And in fact, Harriet's flagging of the commons is a really interesting way in which we might resolve that tension. But it's one that is in future iterations, I think, of the definition of food sovereignty. And Paul alluded to the usufruct rights that I think are sort of transition point if we ultimately, I think, will end up in some idea of the commons soon after the revolution. The third moment where I think that there's stuff to say about food sovereignty is around its geography. And here I was surprised that Jim was reacting negatively to the idea of sovereignty. Because if you look at one of the definitions of food sovereignty, it's about unions and states and communities' rights to do things. And most of us live in communities where we object to what the state is doing, right? There's already a conflict between a community and a state and a union. These are levels that have inherent contradiction in them. And it seems to me that Via Campesina has already some very interesting ways of addressing these sort of many layers of contradiction and many scales in which direct democracy happens. And that is, of course, Via Campesina itself. The way Via Campesina operates is an albeit imperfect, instantiation of a kind of direct democracy. And a kind of direct democracy that you can see most, I think, elegantly wrestled with by the anarchist theorist Andrei Grubacic. He in his book, Don't Mourn, Balkanize. He talks about the Balkans as a place where there are conflicting kinds of territories, where the nation-state is far more porous than it is historically has been in other parts of the world. and where we might imagine organizing along food sheds or watersheds rather than along the contours of the nation state. And so this multi-scalar approach that I think Jim would like, and I guess this is my love letter to Jim right now, is actually what we already see in food sovereignty. And so food sovereignty is about being sovereign at many different levels. And I think that that's what food sovereignty helps us do more than anything else, is to imagine different kinds of political community. The papers here that address First Nations, for example. First Nations mechanisms of government exist within the nation state and hope ultimately to bypass them. But there are different ways in which we can reconceive political communities. And so if we're interested in the sort of the where is food sovereignty, I liked Isabella Junta's paper on Ecuador, where she had a line about food sovereignty is always on the horizon. And it's a horizon-free, I mean, now I'm adding, I mean, it seems to me it's a horizon that is ultimately free of capitalism, patriarchy, and the nation state. But it is, what's interesting about food sovereignty is that it is, to borrow Phil McMichael's ideas around development, food sovereignty strikes me as both a process and a project. Right? I mean, it's a project of ridding ourselves, a project of increasing our autonomy, to use Jan Du's ideas. But it is also a process of getting to that horizon. And that's what's been really interesting to see about the definition of food sovereignty itself, that it's gone through this process. If you look at the declaration, the Women's Declaration from Jakarta, from Indonesia earlier on this year. It's a declaration that couldn't have been written in 1993. It took 20 years to get this amazing declaration about food sovereignty being about an end to violence against women, about food sovereignty being about the renegotiation of productive and reproductive labor. Those kinds of realizations are part of this Hegelian process whereby food sovereignty moves us forward. Since I have to finish right now, I think maybe that's a nice place to end, because I mean, what we're doing here, after all, is engaging in this sort of Hegelian back and forth. And I'm very grateful to Jun and his colleagues for bringing us a very real taste of what food sovereignty might look like. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Raj.